Welcome to Lecture 3, the Development Environment. Now, the main objectives that we have for this lecture are to introduce you to the different components of the forms developer builder, forms builder. And these are the different windows that you work in when you develop a form. Now, I'm only going to briefly go over some of the key components because this is something that you really you have to take a look at to get a sense of. So you'll see this lecture is a little briefer and then the demonstration will be a bit longer, so you'll get a sense of what each of these are. So the main four windows that you work in Forms Builder are the Object Navigator, the Property Palette, the Layout Editor, and the PL/SQL Editor. Now, it's good to realize that if this is the first time you've ever built a client-server application, that a lot of what you're going to find in Forms Builder, you're going to find in a lot of other tools like JDeveloper, Visual Cafe, which are tools which are used to create Java programs. Because a lot of these features, it's like an integrated programming environment. It combines a graphic interface that gives you a feel, roughly what the form is going to look like when you run it, and another place which gives you, all the different components, and another place for properties. And you'll find that, whether you're using a tool to create a Visual Basic program or Java or what have you, that a lot of these will be fairly similar. So, people who have started doing developer and work just with Oracle and PL/SQL, and then you may find, farther down your career that you're doing a much more complex application where you're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you have to do some things in Java and some things in Visual Basic, or, sometimes it happens more that there are some older legacy systems that you need to integrate and you don't want to completely rework them. So you'll find that what you learn by going through this material is also a lot of key elements that you can take with you as you develop in your career and you start to branch out and learn a lot of different other programming tools as well. So the first one that we have is the Object Navigator. Now, the Object Navigator looks a lot like Windows Explorer. When you work in Windows Explorer, you have a list of all the different directories and files, right? I know in Windows Explorer there are actually a number of different views that you can have there. So in Oracle Forms Developer, in the Builder, there's only one way to look at the Object Navigator, and that corresponds, to one way of looking at like the Windows NT Explorer or Windows 98 or 95 or whatever Millennium Edition, which is out now. So you'll see that there'll be nodes that open and close, and this is where you can open and identify the different objects. And what you'll see is that there's also like there's some icons for creating and deleting objects in the Object Navigator. Pretty much it's like a green plus sign for creation and a red X for deletion. So this is where you can go into a node. Let's say it's under Window or Canvas, and if you hit the green plus create icon, then this will create another node. Now what it does is it always has to give it a unique name. So what you'll see is, it'll use its own sequence to determine the number. So it'll add, like, if you're on the Windows node, you create a new window, it'll be called like window 37 or something like that. It's because it's just keeping its own track of the sequence to make sure it doesn't, name something a name that already exists. So most of the time you're going to have to rename it. It's not going to be a useful name for you. And at the same time, you can delete objects here. You can also drag and drop. Now what this means is you can't, of course, drag a window and then put it into like a canvas or something like that. It's not so intelligent that you could say take a canvas, which is a component of a window, drag it into the window and get it assigned and stuff like that, maybe in some future releases. But what the drag and drop features that you have here is more like dragging and dropping from one form to another. And what you'll see is there's a way to either copy it or subclass it in later chapters, we're going to learn about how to have one object's properties related to that in another form or whatever, in case you're keeping a template. But so from our point of view now, when you want to create a new object from another form into your new form, you can just drag and drop it, and we'll see how to do that in the demo. You can also cut and paste, and this is also where you can view and save the forms. Now you also have a node which is for database objects, and when you go through the lab exercises, you'll see that the labs ask you to try to create and change objects, and what you'll find is you can't. And that's to show you that the list of database objects there are just as a way for you to reference to see what's available to you, what are the different tables, what are the different components of those tables, and so on. So it's more like a reference. Now the next thing that you have is a property palette. Now this is really just a list, and what you'll see is it's almost like a huge Excel sheet with two columns. One has the list of the properties on the left, and then on the right are what the actual property are. And when you get to the demo here, I'm going to show you ways of navigating through that. And there are little icons there, and later on we'll explain what those mean. But for the most part, it's got a property name, and then you assign the specific item that you want to assign to that property. So the items are coordinated in the sense that if you select an item on the Object Navigator, you will see the property palette for that property, and then you can change the property. Now the way that you change the property is you just select the right side of the property, and depending on what the property is, if it's a yes, no, like there's a field, there's a property on a database item called required. If you have yes, then that means that it's required for the user to enter that item if they want to insert a new record in the database, and if it's no, then they're not required. And so that would be just a pull down with a choice of yes or no. But some things you actually type it in, like maybe initial value. Let's say it's a database item and you have initial value, then that means that when you first run that form, before that you even give it a value, it'll put something in there, like let's say it's an address list and you have US addresses and foreign addresses, but you want to give it a default of the US, then you can put that as an initial value, and that's what's first there. Or if it's something like an ID which you're generating from a sequence, then that property on the initial value could be a way to get the next value from the sequence. And then what I mean by that you can also change a property at runtime, what this means is depending on different triggers in your form, these triggers can actually change property. Like the one that you have right here, which is set item property, student ID, foreground color red. And what that means is that student ID references an item, student ID on the data block student. And let's say you put this on a button, then that button would change it to be red. Now that probably isn't quite as, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but this is just a very basic example. Something which may be more helpful is you may have like a checkbox, and then when that checkbox is checked, you may have certain items which go gray or whatever. So you could do that with these set item properties. So that's what we mean by changing the properties at runtime. Now the property palette, on the top of the list of all the different items, you have this palette of the different buttons. And what you see, I'm going to run through them, but you're also going to work through these more when you do the exercise to get a better sense of what they mean. Now, copy and paste means that you can take a property from one item and bring it over to another. These are actually more useful when you create something which we call property classes. And when you create those, then you'll be taking a whole group of properties and bringing it into the property class. And that's where you'll be using the copy and paste probably the most. And then you have this button, inherit. And what that means is it gives it the default value. Let's say you've changed some of the values, then you want to go back to the default value. So inherit means that. Now that sounds a little like not the best name for that. And the reason they use inherit is because actually a lot of times you assign property classes and visual attributes. This is something we're going to cover in one of the future chapters. And this is a way to give kind of a default style to a particular item. So what the inherit button does is if you've changed it, let's say you've assigned it a visual attribute which makes it blue, and then now you've made it red, and then you want it to go back to what the visual attribute which you've assigned for this is, then you press the inherit button and it would go back to that. Now this, you'll go over this more in the future chapter, but with these visual attributes or property classes, it's almost like as if you've ever used one of these styles like in Microsoft Word, where it defines the different fonts and size and bold of maybe the heading. And so then you just create that style and you apply it like to the heading of every paragraph. And the same thing you can do here. So you can define the way you want the visual attribute to be, and then instead of having to go into the property palette and changing all those different properties, you can do it all at once. And then, you know, it gets more complicated. You want to undo one of those properties or bring it back, and that's what the inherit button is. Now what this freeze unfreeze button is here is, remember how I told you a few minutes ago that as you navigate through the object navigator, you'll see the different nodes of all the different items in the form, and the property palette's going to correspond to whatever item you have selected in the object navigator. Now let's say you want to compare some of the properties in one item to another, and so go down to the item that you want, you select this freeze unfreeze, and it'll actually freeze the property palette on that particular item. Then you select another item, you can actually open a second window for the property palette window, and then you can compare the two. Because what you'll see when we go through the demo, when you start to work on this yourself, is that there are actually, you know, there are tens and tens of different properties. I mean, maybe not 100, but there are a lot for each item. And so it's hard to remember all the properties that you have, and you want to compare it to the other one to make sure you've got it set the way you want. And likewise, because you have so many different properties in your property palette, it may be also hard for you to find them. So that's why they have this little window. That's the find window. And you type in, say, font, and actually it'll immediately go down to the next occurrence of a property which begins with that. And you'll find this very helpful. Now, if you're already into your property palette and you're not like at the top or whatever, then you may want to kind of search in a different direction, like search forward or search backward. And that's why they have those two little, looks like kind of flashlights, one going up and down, and that corresponds to what you've typed in the find command. Now the layout editor is the graphic user interface. This is GUI. You've probably heard that word a lot, GUI, and maybe you didn't know what it was, so this is what it means. Graphic user interface. And here, this is a GUI which is used to arrange how the form objects will appear at runtime. And it's not quite like, you may have heard that term WYSIWYG, which is what you see is what you get. It's definitely not 100% WYSIWYG, but it does give you a good sense of how the different items are going to look. And you can change the colors there, you can change the layout. There are tools for arranging them or aligning them or like distributing them evenly. And there's quite a lot to learn about how to work through the layout editor. There are a number of different buttons in there, and we're going to go through that in the demonstration. Then you also have a PL/SQL editor. Now, it's good to realize that the PL/SQL editor is like a PL/SQL compile engine that's part of the Forms developer. The reason I just point that out to you is because you may hear about some of the latest enhancements that Oracle has put into PL/SQL, and you may not have those available to you in the latest version of Forms, because it probably takes a little lag time. First, the database developers are going to be developing the database and the PL SQL on the database side, and then the tools developers will integrate that into the tools environment. So there will be cases where the newest thing in PL SQL may not actually be in the form, so you have to be aware of that, what version you're at. So PL SQL editor is a very simple window, and that's where you'll be writing the code for your triggers in PL SQL. So your triggers and your procedures will all be there in one window, and there's actually pull-down lists there, so you can move from one trigger or procedure to another. And likewise, when you're in the Object Navigator, you go to, say, like a button, and then the button has like a when button press trigger on it, and then you'll see when you go to that trigger, you can double click on it, or there's also a right click which will give you PL SQL Editor, and that will open up this window, which is a very plain window where you type in the command. Now what's really nice about the new PL SQL Editor, I think they introduced this in version 6, which is quite nice, is it color codes for PL SQL. It lines it up for you, so if you're doing an if statement and you have like your if, and then you type then, and then your stuff, and then you do your next section of your if, which is like else if you actually type that and it's not lined up to the if above it, when you hit return, it'll line it up. So that's a nice little feature they added to that. Now it's really important to get a sense of the different objects in these in the development environment is that you run through the demonstration, which comes next. And what I'm going to do in the demonstration is I'm going to go through the forms 0301, 0302, 0303, and I'm going to run through the different principles and main qualities in the Object Navigator, the Property Palette, and the Layout Editor. This will give you a better feel of how all of those work. And then after that, once again, it's important for you to run through the chapter, read the text, do the labs, etc. So I'll see you in the next lecture.